want you guys to imagine a time machine. No, we're not launching this right now, but just imagine it. And in the time machine, you go back to Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Edison and bring him back. Bell would have a very hard time to recognize what he had created. Our telecommunications infrastructure has come a very long way. But Edison, with a little bit of help, would recognize the basic setup of our energy grid. Where that video was shot in Chicago 100 years ago, there was the World's Fair. And the breakthrough technology was electricity. City of Lights. We have not come far enough. And while it has created a lot of change, the change ahead of us for the next 20 to 30 years means that how we got here is insufficient. If you take nothing away from our time together today, it's that regardless of where you are in the industry, and it is a privilege to be here with a cross-section of the industry, regardless of your tenure in the industry, regardless of the role you play, we have to fundamentally commit to this idea of digital transformation. And I hope you'll take some time with me to have that conversation. My name is Amar Paul, and like I said, I want to begin by just thanking all of you to be here. What's fascinating about this forum is we have end users, we have consulting engineers, we have distributors, and as an industry, we can have a conversation. We have leaders from NECA and NEMA who are here. Because this conversation, this change effort, will mean every single actor in the value chain has to think differently. I like this chart. It's how long a certain technology took to get to 50 million users. So when the car first came out, it took 62 years. It got progressively faster with every technology. Someone pointed out Pokemon Go took 3 days, but I figured that wouldn't fit, so we left that one off. But it gets much, much faster. To put this in perspective, the iPhone is 11 years old. 11 years ago, this idea of persistent communication, computing, and connectivity came into our lives. Now stop and think about, by the way, one of the other companies that's here is WeWork. Earlier this morning, we talked about transport disruption. Stop and think about how industries have changed and the disruption that's happened from connectivity for people in that time frame. In 11 years, what has been different? What could we not have imagined 11 years ago? One of my colleagues made an observation. In the 90s, good advice to teenagers was, don't meet people on the internet and don't get in cars with strangers. Today, we use the internet to ask strangers to come pick us up, and it's perfectly okay. Which brings me to my last point on this transformation. In each one of these, do you know why London finally decided that it was going to move from sort of horse and buggy to vehicles? You know what the problem they were solving? The waste from the horses. Right? They finally hit a point of they couldn't scale the way they could scale. They had to come up with a different solution. So in all of these transformations, there are 3 phases. At first, the idea is crazy. When my parents first heard of Airbnb, they thought it was crazy, right? Random people are going to show up and stay in my house? That's nuts. They were convinced there'd be mass sort of homicidal events all over the country. Then, after it's crazy, it's dangerous. Oh, well, you know, this could lead to a lot of problems we haven't imagined before. Every one of these transitions, crazy, then dangerous. In third phase, it's obvious. Obvious even to my 70-year-old parents who are now renting out the spare bedroom using Airbnb. Crazy, dangerous, obvious, everyone. The problem is for us as an industry, if you wait until it's obvious, it's too late. Someone has disrupted you. Hotel chains thought they were not able to be disrupted, right? It's a physical asset. How are you going to do that? Until Airbnb came along. Transport companies, well, it's hard to build a car company until Uber and Lyft came along. This will happen in our industry. I can't tell you exactly how. I can't tell you exactly when, but it will happen. And a good bet is it will happen fast, and it will happen using digital technology. So let's look at that digital footprint. This is IP traffic over the last 30 years. Global internet traffic over the last 30 years. Now, 1.1 zettabyte, 10 to the 24, that's a hard number to get your head around. So just remember 1.1, and we'll go with me that it's a big number. Okay, this is what's happened in the last 30 years as we've connected people. Just keep that one number in mind. Now, what I want you to imagine is, where do people get together and talk about the future? In the United States, generally in January, it happens in a place in Vegas called the Consumer Electronics Show. Right? 30 years, massive data growth, lots of connectivity. We get together and we talk about what's next. And one of the things we take for granted is the power stays on. This picture is from the Consumer Electronics Show last year, where the power went out for 2 hours. Do you think the people putting on CES, the cutting edge of technology, had thought about resilience of power? No. But did their infrastructure fail? Absolutely. And by the way, it's not that uncommon. Infrastructure failure happens a lot, and it's expensive. It's expensive in terms of brand impact. It's expensive financially. Here in Atlanta, and those of you who live here or fly through here will remember this viscerally, I know I do, 11 hours, $50 million of downtime. It was an electrical fire that could have been prevented with $5,000 of connected infrastructure. Now, these things are super clear in hindsight. But why is every airport around the country not rapidly moving to connectivity so they can have the same asset awareness that could have prevented that sort of downtime? And how much investment would you need, and how fast would you need to make it for it to be worth it? If you come into JFK or some of our other airports, how do they compare to global airports? How do our train stations compare? The infrastructure we've built, because in the United States we started first, is now the oldest because it was built the earliest. And so there's a pressing crisis of infrastructure upgrades in the country. And if you couple that with what we talked about earlier, that infrastructure has more demands on it. No one is okay with downtime. Right? We talked about this notion of data centers having 5 nines, but show me a hospital that's okay with downtime. Show me a residential neighborhood that's okay with downtime. Show me any part of our daily lives where we connect and interface, where downtime is now considered okay. So these expectations are getting greater. This is where it gets interesting. Remember that 1.1 zettabyte number? It took 30 years for us to hit that. A conservative estimate is that in the next 5 years we'll triple it. Now think about, just stop for a second. We have the good and the great of the industry. Think about how many people we have. Think about engineers. Think about people who do site surveys, commissioning agents. Can we build, imagine we had an infinite amount of capital. Can we build data centers fast enough so that in 5 years we will add the capacity that we added in the last 30 years? And can we do it in a way that our grid can sustain the load? And can we do it in a way that will not pollute further? Because the data centers are the modern factories and the most polluting agents we have. Will how we got here get us there? I don't think so. Schneider Electric doesn't think so. And we think the facts are there to convince you that that is not how this is going to happen. We need a different vocabulary. In addition to that complexity, and this 45% stat comes from Australia, but 80%, even in this country, of new energy will be renewable. My favorite stat on this, and I love this, and I have some friends from Texas who are in the audience. Do you know who owns the most windmills in Texas? It's T. Boone Pickens. So if one of the most famous oil men can understand that most of the energy is coming from renewable, I think all of us can get on board. The problem is now you have multiple input sources as well. So not only is that aging infrastructure we talked about working to keep up with more demand, it's also keeping up with more complexity. So again, how we do it isn't going to scale. And we have issues to deal with here. And this is the one that's most interesting. This is one across the industry I find our collective failure. And this is not a criticism. We're absolutely part of this. But it doesn't make sense. If someone would study how we did this, 50 years, 100 years from now, they would say, that doesn't make any sense. Why did they do that? The part that's interesting is 50% of the waste in the CapEx phase, in the construction phase, is from engineering and waste and rework. And we have stats, we can share this with you. And we can debate if it's 50 or 30. The point is, it's a reasonable number of human capital and rework that happens in the engineering phase. But that's interesting. The one that blows my mind every time is that the life cycle cost of the facility is generally 5 times greater than the CapEx phase. Yet if you think about where we spend all our energy, all our exhaustive efforts in negotiating, in terms of spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to secure dates and timing, it's all in the CapEx phase. And end users are not demanding more support on the OpEx phase, and we're not prepared to provide it collectively. And that's not okay. And I think our perspective as Schneider Electric is that must change, because the end users have to live with it. In the prior panel, the gentleman from Penn Med said, when the ribbon gets cut, I go with the building. Those of you, I love that, right? Now, do you think he cares about that OpEx space? Absolutely. In fact, even the points he was bringing up was about how do I make this work once I own it? And so I think we have to change our mentality, and this notion of total cost of ownership is really important. Now, it's not a new idea. So why when we talk total cost of ownership, is it not something we can engage end users on? Because today it's not a concept that they have data around. They can't measure it. And because you can't measure it, you can't manage it. But with our solutions that we'll share with you, that we've been talking about, we can measure it. Over the last 5 years, when we go across the world and we look at customers we've worked with, these are some of the numbers we can deliver. 35% engineering work optimization, 30% energy efficiency, 22% greater asset utilization. These are hard facts from hard use cases. And we can now start sitting down with end users and building net present value calculations to say, most of your costs are going to come from managing this asset that you're going to have for 20, 30, 50 years. We have this conversation when we buy our homes all the time. Yet when we're building $20 million pieces of infrastructure or $200 million pieces of infrastructure, we don't have these conversations. And that's something we have to change. So our industry has to really get in gear, right? Look, if you can think of an example, tell me, but I will give you a simple assertion. Every industry, every sector that has claimed immunity from digital transformation has been wrong. Every sector that has said this doesn't apply to us has been wrong. Every sector that has said we can keep doing it the way we've always done it has been wrong. The trick is you don't know whether you're in the crazy phase, the dangerous phase, or the obvious phase. And by the time it's obvious, it's too late. So our point of view on this, and this is not an answer, it's the beginning of a conversation. It's a conversation we want to have over the next day and a half with all of you, is that we have to massively invest in EcoStruxure. And an IoT platform with a point of view in terms of how you manage that environment. Now, we're not the only ones providing this, and we'll talk about how we want to enable multiple parties to do this. Our building operations solution, which you'll hear about in another session, works in a building that has no Schneider content in it. Our asset advisor solutions work on non-Schneider content. So we are trying to build an environment that takes into account the real world where a building isn't always full of one manufacturer, because the efficiency argument in the life cycle still applies. But there's a specialization, there's a way to think about the process that changes. So what are those stages? Where do we begin with this different discussion? We'll contend that there are 3 elements. We've got to take those complexity that's in the design phase and rethink it. We've also, for the end users in the room, we have to start with something basic. So really simplify the complexity that we've built up. Because again, we're scaling a system that wasn't designed to scale, not to these levels. We have to enable a management of an ecosystem. So again, not just us, not just one company, but an entire ecosystem where all of you have a role to play and other companies and startups will have a role to play. Think about it, right? In the late 90s, you expected AOL to rule the world. Anyone heard of AOL recently? Some of you actually still have AOL addresses, which cracks me up every time. Like, I want to know where those emails are going, but generally it changes, and it's no one company that invents the future. You have to create an environment where you enable an ecosystem. So we believe in that. And lastly, it's about unleashing learning at scale. We learn every time in singular outcomes. Again, someone on stage said this, I think Tom from Faith mentioned it. They do 10 projects. Well, at Schneider Electric, we're doing hundreds, if not thousands globally. How can we aggregate that learning? So let's quickly touch on each one of these. A lot of times people say, well, where do I begin? You begin at the beginning. I know that sounds really reductive, but how many panel boards have we deployed collectively in this country? Do you know that a simple smart cell for a few $1,000s connected to that panel board can begin transmitting information on the load of that panel to your cell phone? So your entry point is not millions of dollars with tons of software with cybersecurity assessments. It's a few $1,000s on a critical load panel board and say, let's connect that and let's see what happens. And let's capture that data in a secure way, locally, at the edge, on a cell phone. When you get curious and say, what's happening? How can we learn? There's a possibility to begin. We have plenty of customers that started with a simple installation and that have scaled dramatically because as they got more data, they had more questions about their environment. So I don't think this notion of I don't know where to start is valid. Honestly, I think there are very simple entry points we can provide across the stack. The other aspect is we've designed and optimized solutions in multiple spaces. We've built more microgrids in this country than any other provider. It is statistically impossible for you to be online in the United States for more than 6 hours without interfacing with the data center Schneider Electric has built. We know how to do this. So for the consulting engineers in the room, why do we start from scratch? Right? When we think about telecommunications or anything else, we don't sort of start from base infrastructure. We start from what's available, and we build on top of that. So if we start from deep reference designs and build for connectivity, build for the next challenges, we can accelerate our learnings much faster, and we can also reduce a lot of that waste. For data centers alone, when we use standard tested, validated architectures with connectivity built in, we can reduce up to 60% of the engineering waste in the process. Again, because we do this all the time. And it's not just our expertise, it's the expertise of an entire ecosystem we bring in. One example of this is University of Rochester. So University of Rochester works with our services team, and they have a bunch of our solutions in play. But I want to talk about just one core component, EcoStruxure Asset Advisor. So this was monitoring they had a selection number of assets. One of those assets was the transformer. And we'll give you the same stories over and over again because it will give you different insights about them. So in this case, we noticed that there was an issue in the transformer. It went up to our service bureau. Our algorithms picked up that there was a problem. A human being looked at it and called University of Rochester and said, we think there's something wrong with your transformer. We asked them to go run a few tests. They did, and they found there was pressure buildup in the transformer. We said, look, based on our statistical analysis, we highly recommend you replace it. They went to their CFO. They said, no problem, we'll do it in January because the budget cutoff is end of year, so I don't have any money left, but talk to me in January. Typical maintenance conversation. January 26th, transformer blows, there's a fire, the hospital's on the news. Now, we called him and we said, oh my God, what can we do to help? And you know, they were frustrated with their own systems and process, but what was amazing to them, their journey from going to crazy, dangerous to obvious was, wow, not only you predicted this, you could see it. We could see it. I wonder what else in our hospital we're not listening to. I wonder what else we could connect so this doesn't happen again. And that started their journey around this path. So sometimes it's an entry point. It's exposure to what's possible that changes expectations, right? We often talk about kids these days that have expectations that are entirely different from our own because they don't know better. My nephew's 7, and when he wants to talk to people on the phone, he holds up the phone because he assumes all phones have cameras in them. My mom's phone has no camera, so he's just pointing phones at random spaces and no one knows what's happening. But his assumption is there's video in there, right? So because we don't have exposure, because we haven't started, we don't know where to begin. But you begin in very basic entry points. University of Rochester, very basic entry point. Now, they've saved over $1 million with a 20x payback much faster because they see the impact these solutions could have. The other element of this is we have to get this information out in easier ways, right? The reason we've been pushing the My Schneider app isn't because we're having some sort of incentive contest on how many downloads you get, though that would have been a good idea. The reason we're talking about it is we want to use it. Because when you start using it, you'll say, you know, this is what I don't like about it. This is how I can make it better. This is the information I'd really like to get on it. And if we can get more and more people using it, and we have a lot of principals in the room, and generally if it works the same way in your company, when the leaders use it, everybody else starts using it because you ask questions about it. And this is just one example, right? 650,000 users is great, but why is it not hundreds of millions of users, right? Well, maybe it's not useful enough. But how do we make it more useful? We have to get more feedback. And whether it's not this platform or another platform, how do we make sure information is available to the right people at the right time as they need it? And how do we build tools in the digital phase, both in the OpEx cycle and the CapEx cycle? So one example of that, and some of you have seen this, is we went out and we asked a basic question. Where do people, if you're a consulting engineer, if you're a design build contractor, where do you spend your time? And we found you spend a lot of your time doing design work in BIM using Autodesk. So we said, okay, how do we become the first manufacturer to natively plug into Autodesk tools? And so we worked with them, and we've created a sequence where as you're building an architecture, you can natively pull in our information in the design phase. Over time, we imagine a scenario where you can also have templates where you can say, show me what Schneider's perspective of a great smart hospital is supposed to look like, or what a multifamily high-rise is supposed to look like, or what a data center is supposed to look like, or what an industrial plant is supposed to look like. And you can bring that in and get some ideas. You can save your own work, so you have a point of view as a consulting organization. And all of that is happening not in some new application, but in the same seamless workflow that you're already used to. That's, again, one example. I want to come back to Shed Aquarium. I love the video. It's in my hometown. We spend a lot of time sitting down with them. What's fascinating about this example using Building Advisor is they've changed from just managing energy and saving energy to thinking about the experience they're providing. You heard in the video this notion of we want to make sure everybody in the facility is comfortable. One of the things they joke about is their sequence of needs are the animals, the guests, and the employees, right? So they're like, we're very clear who we're looking after. But our logo is Life is On, and I can't think of a better example where we enable life being on than the Shed Aquarium. So think of the number of moving parts: temperature, water pressure, salinity levels. You know, what sort of environments can you change for what sort of animals? How quickly do you have to do it? Chicago's annual temperature change, as you know, can go from really hot to really, really cold. How do you deal with that? If it's a public holiday, do you preheat or pre-cool depending on how many people you expect to show up? So these systems transform from just being energy-saving systems to systems that facilitate the operation of a space. And that's really transformational, right? That's now saying, someone mentioned in the panel, I can use Nest. Well, that's interesting, but how do you get your whole building to be aware? This is how. Another example of this is the T-Mobile Arena. The T-Mobile Arena is one of the newest and most energy efficient arenas in the country. And the fascinating thing is we worked with them from day one to imagine this space. And when you were sitting down having these conversations, one of the things they talked a lot about was transitions. So they have a hockey team, which made it to the Stanley Cup playoffs by accident. I just say that because I never believed in a million years they'd get there that quickly. And it was like, oh no, it'll be great, we have a hockey team. Well, first year. But the next day after the hockey game, sometimes a few hours of the hockey game, the entire space has to be transformed for a conference like this or a concert, right? So the building has to be adaptable. And the experience and security, access, guest experience, suite experience, all has to be real time and world class. And they deliver that by the connectivity. But the other thing they do is they constantly think about how to optimize their buy of energy. So they use resource advisors, sit there and constantly evaluate using our sustainability team where they can buy energy in a clean way, at a good rate, and how that then goes into their management of energy using EcoStruxure Building Operations and EcoStruxure Power Expert. My last point is about taking all this data and doing something with it, right? So if you think about the structure, and I'll show you the slide again of the stacks, you have connected products. You start with a panel board, you connect it. You start with MTZ, you connect it. You start with a drive, you connect it. Then you start getting edge data, local data in your facility. So far, the only people who are benefiting from that is Schneider Electric and you, locally. What if you have multiple sites? What if you're a hospital system with 6 different hospitals across the country? How do you start aggregating and comparing between facilities? How do you learn from every hospital that operates in the country in aggregate? Well, one way is you take the data and you anonymize it. So the data belongs to the customer. Jean-Pascal said that, I want to repeat it. But you anonymize it and you put it out. And today we announced the launch of Schneider Ventures, which is a $500 million fund that will make some of that data available to startups to start building apps on it, right? To start accessing the data and saying, what patterns can we recognize? Can we create solutions and software we can sell back to the end users that say, you know what, we analyzed 6,000 hospitals with 500 beds in them, and here's where you stand on 5 benchmark points versus everybody else. How could we create environments that facilitate that? In the consumer internet, that happened because all of us first got cell phones, then we got, smartphones, and then we just hit agree without thinking about it in every app, and all our data started getting pushed out. Right? That doesn't sound like a smart way to do this with infrastructure, but the basic concept's similar. You connect everything, you capture the data, you push it up to a cloud, and you make that data available to partners and other companies to assess so we can deliver outcomes like this. And so everyone wants to talk about AI. AI is interesting. It's just a way to aggregate a lot of data. But to get the data, you have to connect things to begin with. And we think, again, 22% improvement in asset utilization, 30% improvement in energy. These are conservative estimates. Because again, think about the efficiency gained with technology in the last 30 years in digitization of the human experience. I'll finish with just a few more examples. The Port of Long Beach is one of the largest import ports in the United States. $194 billion of goods and content come in, and when there's a strike in the West Coast, we all feel it in our supply chains. The Port of Long Beach is the first port that said we want a zero carbon footprint. So they decided that a ship that comes in should no longer run its diesel engine in the port. And so the problem we decided we needed to solve together was a shore-to-ship power solution. Think of it as an EV charger for a ship. And the company that worked with the Port of LA to electrify the entire port was Schneider Electric. And we're now working with them to make that infrastructure more resilient by deploying a microgrid. And the next phase of their evolution is to reduce the carbon footprint of the vehicles. So to go to all EVs in terms of the trucks and transport infrastructure that operates in the port. Now, that is the most progressive port in the country. But do you think 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, every port will not want to do this? If you're upgrading or adding capacity to a new port, why would you not want a solution like this? And I think that's the sort of capability and outcomes we're trying to drive, right? So yes, that's the first. But we are learning by doing, and then we can industrialize and bring scale to these solutions all across the country and all across the world. The next example is this building, and you heard about this from Jean-Pascal. One of the interesting questions, and if you're an end user, this is hypothetically to you, though I won't ask you to confess in front of everybody, and if you're any other part of the value chain, next time you're with your end user, ask them this question. Ask a C-level executive, what is their IT budget? Most of them will be able to tell it down to the dollar. Then ask them what their energy spend is. And most people don't know. Do you know in 4 out of 10 cases, their energy spend is much higher than their IT spend? In Hilton's case, the second biggest line item after labor is energy spend, which is why they came to us and said, help us drive more efficiency. And again, do that consistently everywhere in the world. I will also make the observation for those of you who know Schneider Electric outside the US, we do make wiring devices and room controls in this hotel that is not us. So if you don't like your experience, don't complain. So look, EcoStruxure Power is a stack, 3 simple layers, connected products. We have invested more and have more complete portfolio of connected products than any other company in our space. Edge control, where you begin the journey of trying to understand how that information can help you and change your processes and allow you to be more resilient, safe, reliable in your infrastructure. And apps and analytics that takes the collective learning of the transformation of the industry and brings insight back to your operation. And we're going to keep investing in this. You know, the MasterPack MTZ you can go see across the hall is an update of the MasterPack breaker that's been around and is a core competency of the electrified infrastructure of this country. It will have the ability to download competencies directly into the breaker that changes its functionality. So as you build a building with this sort of infrastructure, you don't need to schedule downtime. You can do much more efficient upgrades of your architecture organically. The ION 9000 meter is the most efficient meter on the market, and that's a third-party certification. And at each stage, we will be looking at our product portfolio from this lens. How do we enable digital transformation? How do we make it easier to design, to commission, to deploy? So if we recap, look, the world is going to become a lot more electric. Uptime is a requirement for everybody. We're going to have a step change in operational complexity. And we're all going to have to reimagine how our interfaces work. You know, what a contractor does today will look very different 20 years from now. What a distributor does today will look very different 20 years from now because of the trends we've talked about. And we have to take this journey together, and we have to begin this dialogue. To me, when we look at some of these sites, when you look at some of these hospitals, some of the examples we've shared, I'll leave you with this thought. We believe the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. Some hospitals are smart hospitals. Some data centers are smart data centers. Not all of them are. That was very true of electricity. That was very true of any one of those disruptive changes. So our job together is to make that future more evenly distributed. Thank you very much.